Hello, welcome everybody. Welcome to this month's book club. We're so excited to have you here. We have Scott Keyes with us and Matt, Nomadic Matt, calling in from Europe. And before we go ahead and start this awesome book club, I would love to share my screen and tell you a little bit about TNN. So while I'm doing that, I would love for you to find the chat. And in the chat, can you just write in where you're calling in from, what number event this is for you, and let's say what your best tip for getting a cheap flight is, whether that's something you just learned or something that you've been using for years and years and years. I just love to know. So if you could find the chat and share that, that would be amazing. And I am going to share my screen for 1 second. Okay, so my name is Erica and I help Nomadic Matt run the community arm of our company, the Nomadic Network. We started this back in 2019 before the coronavirus as a way to get people to meet other like-minded travelers and to learn about different resources and meet other people that are traveling so they could stay inspired and travel cheaper, better, longer, and more. Obviously, when COVID hit, we had to pivot and everything turned virtual. And a beautiful thing that came out of that is we were able to connect people from all over the world to speakers and resources all over the world. Right now, I'm in New York City. Scott is in Portland, Oregon. Matt's in Europe, and I'm sure you guys are all over. So it's been a sort of beautiful result of this very weird year. A few things to keep in mind. You can turn your camera on. We love to see your faces. This is a community event. You will be muted. Feel free to use the chat to connect, share your relevant experiences, ask questions. If you do ask a question, I would love for you to type the word question in so that it's easier for me to find. And actually at the end of this, since it's a book club, we do love to open it up so that you can unmute yourself and ask Scott directly your questions. So hopefully that's how it will go at the end and you'll know when that happens. I would also love to point out that Scott and all of our speakers always do this out of the kindness of their heart and their passion for sharing their knowledge with you. So that, for that, we are very grateful. And we also encourage you to, follow them, interact with them. And we really bring you these amazing travel resources so that you can be connected with them forever. So definitely follow him. We're here to learn, satiate your wanderlust, and have fun. I'd love to remind you that for any of our replays, for any of these events, you can join Nomadic Matt Plus, which is our membership network, and you can find that at nomadicmatt.com/NM+. And we'd love for you to follow us on Instagram. You can use these fancy QR codes I made if you want. And that's all for me. I'll pass the mic over to Matt so he can introduce Scott and why he picked this book.
Hey everyone, how's it going? Greetings from Albania. I don't know if it's like how good the brightness is with all the sun behind me, but you make the best of what you can. So very excited to have Scott here. I actually thought his name was Keyes, which I'm sure is a common mistake for everyone. But then again, I've never asked him how to pronounce his last name. So Erica asking him that, I now know it's Keyes. You learn something new every day, Scott. Scott, you can unmute yourself too.
Yeah, no, look, my apologies. I've had friends who have known me for years who only found out, after knowing me for 5 years, Scott, I cannot believe you never told me how to pronounce your last name. So this is my fault. My apologies. Now we all know.
Yes, I will blame you for everything. And so I wish I had a copy of Scott's book, but I don't because I'm on the road and it's in a box back at home. But last month our pick was I Take More Vacations by Scott Keyes, which is a great book, which you might have noticed my blurb at the end of it, or on the back cover, I mean, about not only how to get cheap airfare and the history of airfare, but a good book on a philosophy of travel. and, you know, just getting the most out of your vacations, you know, traveling better, you know, traveling more present, being more present in your trips. So yeah, I'm very excited to have Scott here talking about the book, and we're going to definitely drill him for information on how to get cheap airfare. I know that's probably very high up on all your lists on what to do. It's good to see a lot of familiar faces here. So, you know, with that, we'll kick it off. And Scott, you can just leave yourself unmuted. So let's begin. Why'd you write this book?
Yeah, look, thank you so much for having me. And thank you everybody for being here. I think you'll find over the next 52 minutes that my favorite thing in the entire world to talk about is cheap flights. I love getting into the details, the nitty gritty, the why. And the reason why I love talking about cheap flights so much, and the reason why I wrote this book, is I realized that for so many of us, and for myself included, the airfare and buying the flight is the main barrier that stands between myself and taking as many vacations as I wanted to. You know, when you look at survey data, you find that most people say they want to take 3, 4, 5 vacations every year. But when you look at the actual number of vacations that people are taking, for most folks, you know, we're lucky if it's 2, 1. For many folks, it's 0. And the main barrier that's causing that is the expense and hassle and uncertainty of finding flights, of, you know, knowing that, gosh, I need this flight to be able to get to Albania, to be able to get to Mexico, to get to South Africa. But I don't know, you know, is this fare I'm seeing right now, is it high? Is it low? Is it going to go up tomorrow? Is it going to go down? Is this airline good? What if I need to change my flights? There's so much riding on the flight itself. And yet it's also, it's like, it's one of these things that we hate the logistics of it. And yet you need the flight in order to unlock the trip. And so I figured, look, if I can help folks unlock that flight, then we're able to actually take as many vacations as we all say we want to.
So, you know, a lot of people here, you know, want to know about flights, and you go into a lot of details on it, but what do you think, like, we talked about this sort of on our Instagram live, like why is the act of purchasing a flight just so excruciatingly terrible?
I think the act of purchasing flights is terrible for a few reasons. First, it's because that airfare doesn't behave like anything else we buy. It's not like buying a gallon of milk where the price yesterday is about the price today, it's just about the price tomorrow. But with flights, I mean, gosh, I remember a flight from Atlanta to Amsterdam that on Monday was about $800 round trip. On Tuesday was about $300 round trip. And on Wednesday was about $1,300 round trip. And it was the exact same flight, exact same dates and everything. So it's uniquely volatile. It's not like other things we buy. And yet, if you want to be able to travel, it's essential. You can't, you know, there's no railroad across the Atlantic Ocean. There's no road to be able to drive over to Japan. The flight is something that I think we need, but because it is so, it behaves unlike anything else we buy, and it's seemingly irrational, it ends up adding so much stress to an activity that we're all looking to as a way to de-stress, as a way to add joy to our life. And what we find is that the act of buying flights, at least for most of us, is anything but joyous. And this is why I wanted to help try to give folks the sort of tools and understanding so that it to transform the act of buying a flight from something that's awful to something that's actually really fun. You know, for folks who read the book, you know, I open with the anecdote about the mistake fare that I personally got from that was nonstop from New York City to Milan for $130 round trip. And the funny thing about buying that flight was that unlike normal times when I pay for a flight, you know, at least back then when I'd pull out my credit card and I'd have this sense of dread because I feel like, oh gosh, I'm overpaying. This has cost so much money. I know I need to get this, but it wasn't a happy, positive experience pulling out my credit card. When I saw that $130 flight, I could not get my credit card out of my wallet fast enough. Like, that was such an exciting, fun, joyous moment. And that's the way I think buying flights ought to be. It ought to be as fun as the actual trip itself, because you're buying yourself that excitement, that anticipation, that trip to look forward to without the dread, when you do it in a way that's getting cheap flights and making sure you're not overpaying for them.
That's very true. Everyone likes a good mistake fare. I can see people talking about it in the chat. What are some common, before I get more back into the book and why you wrote it and things, let's sort of talk about the meat of the book. What are some common mistakes people make in booking airfare, and how did that influence what you put into the book?
Yeah, so look, I think there are a few tactical mistakes that folks make, but the thrust of the book is really that I think we largely make strategic mistakes when we book airfare. You'll have to mind my my kitten back here. She is very, I guess she loves the sound of human voices, and so always likes to make an appearance whenever I'm doing live.
Get cheap flights too.
Yeah, exactly. Well, she might hate cheap flights because it takes us away from the house, but actually, I don't know, with her, maybe that's a good thing. Anywho, when it comes to cheap flight mistakes, look, when I talk about the tactical mistakes folks make, I think it's things like not booking at the right time, waiting until, for instance, waiting until the last minute to book your flights in the hopes that the fare will get cheap, that some last minute standby tickets will pop up. This is something that had been true, that had been the case decades ago, but is no longer true and hasn't been true for years. Nowadays, airfare tends to be pretty unpredictable for the sort of like 2 to 6 months beforehand. But then for the last month or so before the travel date, it basically goes up in a linear fashion. And so if you wait until the last minute to book, you can expect to pay higher prices. That, a flight booked a week before travel is almost certainly going to be more expensive than a flight booked a day, or sorry, I have that backwards. A flight 1 day before travel is almost certainly going to be more expensive than 1 week before travel. And a flight booked 1 week before travel is almost certainly going to be more expensive than a flight booked 1 month before travel. So not waiting until the last minute. But when I talk about strategic mistakes, the biggest one that I think comes to mind is this question of how to approach booking flights and planning vacations in the first place. The way that I would sum it up is that we've basically been booking flights backwards if we're hoping to get cheap flights. Now, what I mean by that is, look, we all say, look, we really want cheap flights. Cheap flights are great. It helps us travel more. I'd love to be able to pay $300 for my flight to Europe rather than $1,000. And yet the way that we are traditionally booking our flights is actually antithetical to getting cheap flights. What I mean by that is it's normally a 3-step process that we use when we're booking flights that I call the destination first method. We pick our destination, we pick our dates, and only on step 3 do we look, well, what do the flights cost? And by setting price as the last priority, it's not terribly surprising that we end up with some pretty expensive flights. And so what I say is, like, look, if cheap flights are a priority, if you're really hoping to get cheap flights, if you're coming up to me asking, Scott, how do I get cheap flights? One of the best things I'm going to tell you is take that normal 3-step process and flip it on its head. Step 1, where are there currently cheap flights out of my home airport? Step 2, of those places where there are cheap flights out of my home airport, which one interests me the most? Step 3, what dates work for my schedule? And by setting price as the top priority rather than the last priority, that's how you get cheap flights. And that's how you can afford to take 3 or 4 vacations for the price that you used to pay for one. Remembering too that, a lot of folks might hear this and think, oh, well, cheap flights out of my home airport, that means that, if I'm in New York, I'm only going to be flying to, I don't know, Philadelphia or Pittsburgh or something. No. remembering that airfare is something that is extraordinarily volatile and bears little, if any, relationship to how far you fly. I'd like to give a recent example. Just a month or two ago, we found flights out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, all the way over to Tokyo, Japan for 2022 for as little as $316 round trip. It's on a 5-star airline. Do you know where else you could fly for $316 round trip out of Pittsburgh? Philadelphia. And so remembering that there's not necessarily this like obvious relationship the way there is when you're driving, and, you know, the amount of gas you use is going to be completely dependent on how far you go. With flights, it's not like that at all. And so remembering that cheap flights can and will pop up out of your home airport. And the more time you can give yourself, the more patient you can be, the better your odds of getting a cheap flight that you're going to really be excited about.
Yeah, it's always, you know, like right now, domestic flights are so expensive. You know, I mean, you go anywhere domestically, you're like, you want how much money for that flight? I can go to Tokyo for that amount, you know, and there is no rhyme or reason to airfare. And I think because there's sort of like price transparency and so many other things, people assume you'd have like a logic to pricing for airfare. But, you know, I mean, one of the things you bring up in the book, you know, is that like flights to Europe and, you know, one ways, right? Like a one way to Europe is often more expensive than a round trip. Like for me, like I always book a round trip and I just chuck the end, because like you try to book a one way, they're like, oh, you must be a business traveler. Cause you know, so can you talk a little bit more about how, you know, airlines bucket people into business and sort of tourists and how that can affect?
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought this up, because I think my only slight quibble would be it's not that there's no rhyme or reason to it. It's just that the logic that is used to set airfare and to set prices is not necessarily the first order logic that we would assume from the outside. You know, it's easy to assume, oh, a one-way should cost about half the price of you know, of a round trip flight, or there's no way that it should cost the same to fly from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia as Pittsburgh to Tokyo. But when you dig into the actual airline economics of why prices tend to be set like that, it starts to make some sense about that it can actually be, if not predictable, at least make some semblance of sense. But your point is definitely valid, that the business travelers is largely the reason why we see such volatility and so much of the sort of like so many of the airline pricing dynamics that we see today. So take something like a one-way trip to Europe. That is extremely expensive. And the reason why one-way flights are so much more expensive is because airlines want to make sure that they are charging as much as possible to folks who are willing to pay more. They want to maximize a traveler's willingness to pay. And who is it that is willing to pay the most? It's largely business travelers, because they don't care what the price costs. It's their company paying, not them. You and I, you know, like vacationers, leisure travelers, we care a lot what the price of a flight costs, because any dollar we spend on that flight is a dollar we're not spending on vacation, and it's a dollar that is coming out of our actual bank accounts. And so we tend to be what's called very price sensitive. If the price gets pretty expensive, we're much less likely to buy. If the price gets cheaper, we're much more likely to buy. Airlines know this. They know that business travelers are price insensitive, and that leisure travelers, vacationers, are very price sensitive. And so what they want to do as a result is try to price the types of tickets that business travelers buy much more expensively. And they want to price the types of tickets that leisure travelers buy much cheaper in order to be able to sell more of them. And so this is why, for instance, it's oftentimes you'll see a huge price drop if you search for a trip that's 7 days long rather than 6 days long. And that's, you know, you might What the heck's the difference? It's 1 day. Well, the difference is that many flights have written in their fare rules that in order to get the cheapest fare, it has to have a minimum 7-day stay. And the reason why they have that minimum 7-day stay is because they want to make sure that business travelers are not getting the cheapest flights. Business travelers, they don't necessarily want to be gone for a week. They want to get home, visit their family. Their business trip might only be Monday through Friday. And so they'll say, okay, the airlines will say, okay, it has to be a 7-day trip to get the cheapest one, or you have to stay a Saturday overnight in order to get the cheapest one, knowing that very few business travelers are going to buy those tickets. Whereas for leisure travelers, for vacationers, absolutely. I don't want to go to Europe for less than a week. If I'm traveling, I want to have Saturday as part of my trip. And this is, there are any number of ways that airlines use to try to differentiate between who is a business traveler and who is a leisure traveler and price them accordingly. It's like the airlines, they could just ask you, Matt, are you a business traveler or are you a leisure traveler? But look, we're humans. We're going to lie, especially when it benefits us financially. And so they know they can't exactly do that. They have to price the tickets in a way to try to, according to the traveler's behavior, not just what they say they are.
So when you were writing this book, and, I had someone who also writes books and knows the process, how did you go about writing this book? What did you start with? I'm sure, I know the final version is not what you even began with. How did it change over time? There's sort of like a good balance between here's how airfare works and here's my philosophy on travel. How do you pick that balance? What was sort of the writing process for this book like? How long did it take?
It was a very funny thing. I have my young daughter actually to thank for this book coming to reality, because about 2.5 years ago, I was on paternity leave. We do parental leave for all employees at Scott's Cheap Flights, and sitting there, got a young daughter napping on my chest. I have a lot of time to think, trying to decide how do I want to spend my time when I come back from paternity leave, and realizing writing a book, taking all this knowledge, I'm constantly getting asked, Scott, how do you find cheap flights? What can I do in this situation? Do you think I should get this flight? Is it too expensive? I wanted to try to give others the tools and the skill set that I kind of had internalized over the years. But where I really, I think, got really lucky was in meeting my agent, my editor, who helped encourage me to take this book from something that was just, I had a much more narrow vision of just, hey, let's just make this like here's all the things you need to know in order to get cheap flights. And they encouraged me to go broader and look at not only that sort of skill set, but also the entire sort of philosophy of why cheap flight, not only how to find cheap flights, but why cheap flights are so life-changing. And that was one of actually my favorite parts of researching and writing the book, was realizing how incredible, I'd always just sort of taken it for granted. Oh yeah, cheap flights are great. But then realizing all the myriad ways in which they change not only your travel style, but your life in general. So when I started prioritizing cheap flights, what it meant was that not only was I taking more vacations than I would have otherwise, I was taking 3 or 4 trips for the price I used to pay for one, but that meant that I was being able to visit 3 or 4 times the number of destinations as before. And when I had one, in my past life, when I had one vacation a year, I would go to the big hits. I'd go to Rome and London and Tokyo. And don't get me wrong, these are wonderful places, but some of my favorite vacations have been to kind of those hidden gems, Taiwan, Trinidad and Tobago, Lithuania, those types of places I just fell in love with. And I'm not sure I ever would have made it to those countries if I would only been taking one vacation a year, because I wouldn't have wanted to take a risk on somewhere that was further down the list. You kind of go to the more traditional favorites. One of the funny things that I learned in writing this book, and I was happy to share, is this notion that travel is a skill. It's a muscle. It's not something that we're born with. We think of it as just an escape. But what you find is that the more you travel, the better you get at finding the types of places and the types of activities that you as a person, as an individual, enjoy. You start off your vacation career doing these sort of average, the median stuff, what tends to appeal to the average tourist, but you're not the average tourist. You're you have your own individual tastes and preferences. And that was one of the beautiful things in realizing, gosh, the more I travel, the more I find the places that I really love, and the better the next trip is going to be, because I'm knowing better. Okay, I like traveling at this pace. I like having leisurely mornings, but packed afternoons. I like really finding those, hidden kind of street food stalls rather than doing 5-star dining. I like I skip the like nightclubs and get up early and go for a run in the morning. All those types of things that I didn't know the first time I traveled, but taking more trips and prioritizing cheap flights allowed me to kind of speed up that process. And now I enjoy travel even more than I did when I was younger.
It reminds me of that Adam Sandler sketch from SNL. We can take, like, he's a tour guide in Italy, and he's like, if you're sad at home, you're going to be sad in Italy. And there's one part, he's like, we can take you hiking, but we can't turn you into a hiker. So, like, knowing what you like as you learn to travel is definitely true. Like, you're not going to be a magical, like, lover of hiking. Travel definitely helps you figure out your personality a bit. So, how do you strike that balance between inspiration and information? Like, what was the draft process like?
Yeah, look, I think the very first draft I wrote of the book had 45 different chapters. It was all very like micro information, piece by piece. And again, it was just so fortunate to have a wonderful editor. I'm sure you know this, Matt, with the writing process, and anybody else here who's written a book. It is remarkable how different the final product is from that first draft, in a very humbling way, because you always think, that first draft, you're like, all right, this is good, this is great. And then to see it get torn to shreds in a very good way, that it ends up much better than it had been before. And so there were a couple things that, I think big shifts from the original first draft of the book to the final product. One was condensing it down into much more thematic chapters rather than just sort of tiny little micro advice chapters. Two was adding in some information about, in chapter 10, should you take that trip, how to think about over tourism and emissions. That was one that I had sort of had in the back of my mind, I wanted to write about, but I hadn't found a place to slot it in. And then just in this sort of third or fourth draft of it, talking with my editor, talking with my agent, we realized, yeah, we should try to find a place to do this. Why don't we add a new chapter for that? And then finally, this book was one that had been written, it was started well before the pandemic. It was finalized during the pandemic, and then came out, in May of this year. And so having to try to put in at least a little bit of information about COVID, especially in the myths chapter, because one of the funny things that's happened in the past 12 to 18 months is, I think a lot of folks woke up, especially during the pandemic, to how cheap flights were. But what they may have missed is just how cheap flights were before the pandemic. And a lot of folks assume they're only cheap because of the pandemic. So wanting to do a little bit of gentle nudging, that we have been living in what I call the golden age of cheap flights for years. This is not something that only started in 2020. It's been going on since at least 2015.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, and cheap flights are still out there. I mean, as I tweeted to you yesterday, I just found, what was it, $50 from LA to Orlando and vice versa. And that was Spirit, but Delta was like 62, like that's incredible for a one-way flight on, an airline.
Yeah. And it's one of those things that I really want to encourage folks. Like, look, you're going to have a lot of headlines about, airfare's getting so expensive. It's nothing like it used to be. But remembering that flights are not something where it's a homogeneous price. Flights have an incredible diversity of price. There are expensive flights, absolutely, and there are cheap flights. And so even if the average airfare is going up as it is right now, that doesn't necessarily matter at all, because you can't book average fares. You can only book available fares. And so it doesn't matter to me if other people are paying more for their flights. All that matters to me is how often can I find those cheap flights, like Matt mentioned, that $60 flight from LA to Orlando. Those flights yesterday we found to Hawaii for $198 round trip. Are those still popping up? Because those are the ones we care about. If the person sitting next to me on my flight tomorrow paid $1,000 to be there, that doesn't impact me at all, as long as I paid a cheap price to be on that plane.
Yeah, I mean, I hate these headlines like, oh, cheap airfare is over. I mean, in the sense, we'll see an average increase in flight prices in the aggregate, but that doesn't mean your specific flight is going to be expensive.
Exactly.
And I mean, I tell people, you and I, like, we work in travel, so sometimes we can't be as flexible as we'd like to be. But I definitely think flexibility in airfare can be hugely important. And one thing I really liked is in your book was sort of how you flip that script, rather than be like, I'm going to go to Paris. You can say like, well, I'm going to go to Europe, and where's the cheapest flight?
Yeah, exactly. I'm one of the people that I spoke with for the book, Kristen. She and her boyfriend live in Atlanta, and they really wanted to take a couple's getaway sometime in the spring. But they could have gone the traditional route. They could have said, okay, we want to go on to Aruba, and let's choose March 10th through 17th, and let's just cross our fingers, hope and pray that a cheap flight pops up around that time. And to do so, that would have been what I call a very narrow cheap flight bullseye, because they chose their destination, they chose their dates, and then they're just hoping something hits that very narrow target. Instead, the way Kristen went was said, okay, we want to travel sometime in the spring, late winter, and we want to go somewhere warm. And after that, we're just going to leave it up to the cheap flight gods. Like, wherever a great deal pops up out of Atlanta, that's going to be the one that we jump on. And so it might, it could have been Puerto Rico, it could have been Jamaica, it could have been Cancun. It just so happened to be that a great deal, I think it was $377 round trip from Atlanta to Hawaii, popped up in their inbox. And so that's where they ended up going that year. And it's not that they wouldn't have necessarily, like Aruba might not have been the top choice, but would you pay $1,000 to go to Aruba or $377 to go to Hawaii? For most folks, when you at least think of it as comparison shopping, they say, I'd rather go to Hawaii for that price. And Aruba is still going to be there. It's not going anywhere. I'll go there when the flights get cheap, remembering that there's not a single set price to any destination. They're like a roller coaster. And so when they're high, just be patient, skip it. When they're low, that's when you pull the trigger. It's like today's expensive flight is tomorrow's cheap flight, and vice versa.
Too true. All right, as we're moving past the half hour, there's tons of questions here. I've been watching them pop in. So one of the things, we want to make this do is pretend we're in a bookstore, but virtually, and Scott is there. So Scott has given his spiel. Now we're opening it for questions. So Erica,
Wonderful.
Back to you.
Yeah, I'll call on you. And if you don't unmute yourself in like a few 30 seconds, then I'll just ask your question for you. But Tracy Wallace had a good question. Tracy, would you like to unmute yourself?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I work in the school system, so I'm stuck with the Christmas, spring break, summer situation. Is there a lot in the book or the tips that would apply to somebody in my situation?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, you're absolutely right that it's going to be a little bit more difficult when your schedule is constrained. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but the things that you can do to still optimize for cheap flights, to still be able to get them, are plentiful. And so that's everything from, for instance, being flexible. You don't have much flexibility on dates, it sounds like, but there are a couple other areas where there's still a ton of flexibility if it's just a normal vacation, if it's somewhere you want to go, and that is where you go and when you book. And so rather than, for instance, deciding, okay, I'm going to go from my home city to Lisbon on August 10th through 17th, right before school comes back in session, saying, I'd love to go to Europe sometime this summer, and I'm going to see where those deals pop up, rather than just saying Lisbon. Maybe, maybe that deal pops up to Rome, maybe it pops up to Vienna, maybe it pops up to Madrid, and then you're able to just pop over to Lisbon anyway if you want. You can fly in and out of Madrid and still be able to get to your preferred destination. But then also remembering that you have flexibility about when you book. And so this is using what I call the Goldilocks windows in the book. The best way to time booking your flights is not to wait until last minute, because we talked about how those flights tend to get very expensive, because again, business travelers tend to book their flights last minute. But also you don't want to generally book them too early, because fares tend to be more expensive early, and you miss out on future sales, on future price drops, if you lock in the just mediocre price too early. And so if you're traveling during a peak travel period, which it sounds like you would be either, the winter holidays or the middle of summer, for domestic flights, the Goldilocks window for when cheap flights are most likely to pop up is about 3 to 6 months in advance. For international flights, it's more like 4 to 10 months in advance. And the simplest way that I use to remember that, rather than trying to remember, this number of months, this, that, always book opposite season. If you're hoping to travel during middle of summer, always book opposite season. If you're hoping to travel during winter holidays, book opposite season. It's the same, just like swimsuits are cheaper in the winter and a down coat is going to be cheapest in the summer. It's the same with flights. And so around now is when you ought to be thinking about booking those winter holiday flights, because now is when they're much more likely to be cheap than if you wait until, let's say, November.
That's a great analogy. Okay, so Brian has a question about mistake fares. Brian?
Thanks, Erica. Scott, very, very interesting conversation we're having, but about mistake fares, is there any strategy to mistake fares, or is that total luck?
So insofar as their strategy, and thank you for the question, Brian. Thank you for the question, Tracy. Insofar as their strategy for it, there's like a slight boost in the sense that they are slightly more likely to pop up during times when airline employees are not on the job. And so think nights, weekends, and holidays. We see slightly more mistake fares pop up at those times than you would say in the middle of a weekday. But mistake fares, by their nature, and for folks who don't know, mistake fares are when when a flight gets priced just cartoonishly low. I mean, that $130 round trip flight I got to Milan, $169 round trip from San Jose to Tokyo. When those pop up, there's basically no way to predict or know in advance that it's going to pop up, because again, by nature, it's a mistake. And so the best way to find it is just to be constantly searching. Think of it as like you're searching for a snow leopard in the mountains. I don't know if anybody's watched those Planet Earth episodes or what, that you see the lengths to which they go to just spot this one rare thing that occasionally pops up, but you never know, will it pop up, won't it? And so constantly being on that.
Subscribe to Scott's Cheap Flights newsletter, and
that's right. I mean, look, if you're the type who loves to search all day every day, God bless you. I'm that way for whatever reason. But for most folks, searching for flights all day, every day is not their idea of a good time. They'd rather, do whatever they love to do, live their life, but still know when those cheap flights, when those mistake fares pop up. And that's what we do at Scott's Cheap Flights, is we make sure we're always monitoring, always searching. So when those mistake fares pop up, you don't end up missing it. Because the funny thing about mistake fares is that they don't tend to last very long. I mean, we're lucky if a mistake fare lasts 6 hours. It tends to be basically as soon as the airlines can find it and fix it. And so if you're one of the lucky few who find out about it right as soon as it pops up, then you can take advantage.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you.
Brian also has another question about skip lagged. Brian, do you want to just ask that?
Yes, I know there's an aggregator out there, skip lagged. I don't know much about them, but I hear they're very good. What do you think of it?
So the way skip lagged works is that they specialize in a method called hidden city ticketing. One of the examples I use in the book is that let's say you're flying, I believe it's from Orlando to Richmond. If you were to book a flight from Orlando to Richmond that goes via Newark, just outside New York City, it cost, I don't know what the exact price was, but I think it was like $97. But if you were to book a flight from just Orlando to Newark, it was like $150. And so in a sense, you saved $50 by flying all up to Newark and then down to Richmond. So if you wanted to go to Newark or New York City, it would actually be cheaper to book a flight to Richmond that goes via Newark than it would be to book a flight just to Newark. That's called hidden city ticketing, basically getting off at the connecting city rather than getting off at the final destination. The airlines hate it because it really kind of frags their normal pricing algorithms, but there's nothing illegal about it. It's not against the law. And it even has the blessing of the New York Times ethicist who said, think of it like you order an extra large pizza. You don't have an obligation to eat every single slice. You're allowed to eat as much or as little as you want of it. And so skip lag specializes in finding those hidden city tickets. You want to make sure this is not a beginner tactic. You want to make sure all the kind of ins and outs of it, including you need to book a one-way rather than a round trip, because as soon as you skip a segment of your itinerary, the rest of it automatically gets canceled. So if you had a return flight a week later, that would get canceled out if you skipped that flight from Newark to Richmond. You want to make sure you don't check a bag, because that checked bag is going to Richmond, not to Newark. But as long as you're comfortable with it, and as long as you're not abusing it, doing it, 10, 20 times a year, it tends to be something that can be, that you can really get some good deals on occasion. It's not a silver bullet. It's not going to be every single flight is going to be cheaper as a hidden city ticket, but it can occasionally benefit. Skip lag helps find those. And I've done it a couple times in my life, worked out just fine.
Thanks a lot.
One thing I would caution, though, is that if you get caught, the airlines will penalize you by stripping your frequent flyer program. It's one of the things that they'll do. So I would say don't do it to the airline you are the most loyal to. I'm a Delta fanatic. I'm not messing my status up to save $50. Scott, you feel the same way?
Yes, like a lot of folks, for instance, if they're doing this, especially more regularly, they're not putting in their frequent flyer number. Maybe they're like you said, not doing it on their favorite airline. I think the main thing, don't announce to the airlines or any of the agents what your intention is. Don't say, oh, I'm just going to Newark, I'm not going to Richmond. But look, people miss flights all the time. If you're just doing it once or twice, you're not going to get it. Like the likelihood of getting caught is very low. Again, you want to make sure you understand and are comfortable with the risks yourself. But where people really tend to run into problems is when they're abusing it rather than just every once in a while.
Also, Kathy said that she did this on her way, like on a round trip ticket on way there, and then they wouldn't let her on the way home use that ticket because it does cancel out the rest of your tickets, right?
Yeah, exactly. My apologies, Kathy. That's one of those situations where you'll only want to do it on either a one-way ticket, because again, knowing that the airlines will automatically cancel the rest of your itinerary, or it could be a situation where you do it just on the return leg of a round trip ticket. So let's say it was a flight that was Orlando to New York, and then New York to Orlando, and then on to Miami, and you skipped that Orlando to Miami leg. That would be an instance where you could do in a round trip. But this is why hidden city ticketing is not a beginner tactic. You want to make sure that you really kind of know the what you're getting into through and through, and you can kind of assess and evaluate whether the savings are worth the risks.
Yeah, definitely. Robin has a question. Robin, would you like to unmute yourself? All right, I'll ask Robin's question. What factors should you consider when choosing to travel out of another airport other than your own home airport?
Yeah, great question, Robin. So there are a number of factors to consider, but one of the like, a lot of folks think of it as just, oh, it's less convenient if I'm flying out of a different airport than my own home airport. And while that's true a lot of cases, one of the like the most inspiring stories that I cover in the trip is the Shanna Lathwell and her family. So they live in Detroit, and she had always been the planner for the family. She wanted to take her family to Bali, but flights from Detroit to Bali are usually like $2,500 round trip. I mean, it is expensive. Not only is it expensive, it's usually, you know, at least 2 connections, if not 3, long layovers. It's not an easy or quick or cheap flight. So she'd always kind of had it on the back burner whether or not she'd be able to take her family to Bali, considering there are 5 of them and it would cost $12,500 in normal time. But when she got an alert in her inbox one morning saying that flights had just popped up to Bali out of Chicago for $500 round trip, she realized, oh my goodness, I can get 5 tickets from Chicago to Bali for the same price as 1 ticket from Detroit to Bali. And remembering that, look, you know, sure, it's a little more convenient to go to Detroit than Chicago, but was it $10,000 more convenient? Absolutely not. And so not only was it certainly worth the savings in her case to be able to schlep over to Chicago, the funny thing was, even with the transit time of driving over to Chicago, the flights out of Chicago were a 1 connection flight. It went Chicago to Taipei, then down to Bali, with just a 2-hour layover in Taiwan en route on a 5-star airline. And so what that meant was that the total travel time, even with the 4 or 5 hour drive from Detroit to Chicago, was going to be about 30 hours. Whereas the total travel time from Detroit to Bali with all the connections and layovers was going to be about 35 hours. So she actually saved 5 hours of travel time by going over to Chicago and then flying out from there. She could have gotten lunch, a massage, you know, surfing lessons and everything, probably spent $10 in the process because everything is so extraordinarily cheap in Bali while she was waiting for her friends who are coming from Detroit. And so this is why it can be helpful to cast a wide net. Obviously prioritize your home airport, but keep an eye on nearby airports and decide if savings and convenience might be worth it. But the main thing you want to be sure of is that if you're traveling out of an airport and you're getting a connecting flight there, you want to have a good buffer between those flights. So for instance, I traveled to one of the hidden city tickets I did actually was from New York to Barcelona for about $200 round trip. I was living in Denver at the time, and so I had to get a flight from Denver to New York and then a different flight from New York to Barcelona. If my Denver to New York flight had gotten majorly delayed or canceled or something, I would have risked missing that flight to Barcelona. They're not going to hold the plane for me. And unlike normal times when you have a single itinerary, they're not going to reaccommodate you on the next flight because you just missed the flight for their intents and purposes. So this is why you want to make sure you build in at least plenty of time. You know, If it's an evening flight, get in the morning and give yourself some sightseeing time in New York. Even giving yourself 24 hours, get in the day before, take a day in New York, explore, hang out with friends, and then go on to Barcelona. That's generally the best practice when you're getting a sort of a connecting flight out of a different airport other than your own.
Those are such good tips. We have a question from Doug. Doug, do you want to ask your question on premium and business class fares?
Sure. Scott, any special tricks for premium or business class airfares that we should be looking at?
Great question, Doug. So the business class fares are one that I'm sure I don't have to tell you are significantly more expensive than economy fares. We regularly see flights in economy over to Europe for $300 or $400 round trip right now and for the past few years. But a normal business class fare over to Europe is something more on the lines of $2,000, $2,500, sometimes even $3,000, depending on where you're flying out of. So it's not, twice as expensive or 3 times more expensive. It can be up, 6, 7, 8 times more expensive than economy. And that's why it's all the more important to make sure you're getting a good deal. The main ways that I think to be able to get access to business class seats and whatnot for folks who are not necessarily millionaires is to get the points and miles. This tends to be where I think the points and miles really excel in value, being able to book those business class seats. Because oftentimes, we mentioned the cash price of a business class seat might be 7 or 8 times higher than economy, but a number of miles required for a business class seat might only be 2 or 3 times what it costs in economy. And so this is why many folks, really are into the points and miles game as a way of being able to sit on those, get those lie flat seats, the champagne, the works. For many folks, that it can be the best value. But aside from points and miles, it's generally going to be the same sorts of strategies they use to get cheap flights, no matter where in the airplane you're sitting. Giving yourself flexibility and not hamstringing yourself from the get-go by saying, I'm going here on these dates and let me just hope a cheap deal pops up. The more you can broaden your possibilities. I'll fly anywhere in Europe rather than one destination. I'll go anywhere in the fall rather than saying September 10th through 17th. The more kind of you can broaden what's called your cheap flight bullseye, the better your odds of getting a good deal. And then lastly, we just launched an elite tier on Scotch Cheap Flights because folks had been asking for so long, hey, look, even when I'm buying the business class seat or the first class seat, I want to make sure I don't overpay. And so that's why we started searching for those business and elite and first class tickets for the elite tier to make sure that folks are never overpaying no matter where on the airplane they're sitting.
That's
yeah,
amazing.
and I'm currently premium grandfathered, so I'm looking.
Well, thank you, Doug.
Deals.
I appreciate your being a Scotch Cheap Flights member. That really means a lot to me. Thank you.
I think we have quite a few on the call, but actually the last question I wanted to ask you is if you could just explain what you do at Scotch Cheap Flights and how people could benefit from your obsession with finding cheap flights and sharing them with other people.
Absolutely. Look, I want to start out by saying my day today, I spend a lot of time feeling pretty terrible. And the reason why I feel pretty terrible a lot of the time is because Scotch Cheap Flights is not a one-man operation. There are actually 40 people on the team, including half a dozen flight experts who are so good, the world's best at finding cheap flights. And so the reason why I feel bad about that is, I get hit up on Twitter and email and Facebook all the time. Thank you, Scott, so much for this amazing deal you got me and my wife to Hawaii. Thank you for helping our family get to Bali. And I feel terrible because I feel like I'm getting the credit that is really due the entire team. So I would be remiss if I didn't plug that it is an incredible team effort, not just as a one-man operation. My day-to-day is something that really, as I'm sure Matt can attest to as well, starting a business is one of those funny things where what you need to do, the demands of the business are going to change every 6 months. So, when I first started out, it really was a one-man operation. I was finding flights. I was writing the emails. I was responding to customer inquiries. I was talking to media. I was building the website. I was, fixing things that were broken. I was doing all the hats. Luckily, I met my co-founder, Brian, now our CEO, who took on a lot of the behind the scenes work. And then we just kind of kept expanding from there. And so my role has shifted from one that was jack of all trades to then being sort of the primary and only flight searcher, make sure every single deal was one that I found and sent out, to now being what's called the chief flight expert. And so my role is chatting with fine folks like you all about cheap flights, out there preaching the gospel of cheap flights and why they're so wonderful and magic and life-changing, talking with media about what sorts of trends we're seeing. It's on live radio this morning in San Francisco about the Spirit and American Airlines cancellations that are happening right now. Got a call right after this with the Washington Post about what sorts of travel trends we're seeing with the for this fall. Getting to really kind of be that advocate for consumers and that advocate for cheap flight lovers, both in a community sense and in terms of media. And that's what my kind of day-to-day looks like now. But as I'm sure Matt can attest, every day is different. There's no normal day. And that's one of the reasons why I feel so blessed to be able to be a cheap flight expert, because it's one of those things where I get to do the work I love and get to look forward to every day, helping other people travel. I don't get to travel nearly as often as I would like to, but living vicariously through all your trips is what gives me that's always the best part of my day. So thank you to everybody who writes in to let us know when you get those great deals.
That's awesome. I encourage you guys. I know we didn't get to every single question. I'm so sorry about that. We had over 100 people on this call and we had lots of great questions. I just dropped in the chat all the ways you could get in touch with Scott or any of his team members. So if you still have that question, I encourage you to reach out and ask and get it answered. Getting cheap flights is the way to take more vacations. So if that's your end goal, that's what you should learn how to do. So I'm so glad you guys are all here today for our awesome talk on take more vacations. Does anybody else have their book? Does anyone have their book? Can we see? Can I take a screenshot really quick? Can everyone smile or cover their face with the book? Wonderful. So nice. Matt, would you like to say anything before I close out with some announcements?
Yeah, Scott, thank you for doing this. Everyone give Scott a virtual round of applause. Again, if you need to reach him, Erica dropped all the information in the chat. Definitely sign up for their service. There's a free version and a premium version. So, you pick the one that suits you, though premium comes with lots of cool perks. Next month, our next book, I don't know if I'm stealing Eric's gem here, but we are going to have Turn Right at Machu Picchu, Turn Left at Machu Picchu, Turn Right at Machu Picchu, with one of my favorite travel books out there. It's just one top of its field, and Mark is going to be joining us. He wrote, we'll be talking about some of his other books too, taking your questions. If you haven't read it yet, you definitely should. It is one of the all-time best travel books out there.
Thank you, Matt. Yes, you are stealing my thunder a bit, but that's okay. Like Matt said, this is our next travel book club. We actually have the next 3 on our website already, so feel free to go sign up for those. We love having you at our book clubs. We love, you guys are such readers and such author fans that we love to host these. Also, I saw a lot of you, this was your first event, so I just want to let you know what's happening and where you can find the rest of our events. It's at thenomadicnetwork.com/events. We are doing still a lot of virtual events, but actually tonight is our very first in-person event in Portland, Oregon. So you can find out about everything happening at this website, and you can sign up. All of our events are, you know, traveler friendly. So as long as you're not a travel naysayer, you're welcome. And then I would love to invite you, if you found value today, to join our Nomadic Matt Plus community. That's where you get exclusive tips and advice for your travels. We have a ton of offerings for people in our community. One of our favorite things that we love to talk about now is we do monthly giveaways. The next monthly giveaway that we're giving away is we have a ticket, a free domestic ticket. So if you guys are, if you guys are in our community, nomadicmatt.com/NM plus, you have a chance to win that. And all you have to do is be a part of our community. And then we just pick random winners. So we have a whole lot more perks, and we would love to invite you to be a part of that. And you can just use the QR code or that URL. And then last but not least, I'd love to thank you for being a part of our community. Honestly, these are the highlight of my pandemic. And the reason that is because of like you all, you know. And so thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Matt, for putting this together. And thank you, Scott, for donating your hour to teaching us how to get more flights. And thank you for, you know, spending your paternity leave writing this book so that we could all learn. I will say that personally, I feel like a cheap flight expert, and I learned so much from this book that I was taking notes on. And so I highly encourage you, if you have not read the book, go get the book, read the book. You'll learn something worth at least the price of the book. So thank you so much for being here, and have a wonderful day.